usually do. Obviously, this is not always the case, such as last year when we were all quarantining. Nevertheless, this dinner and occasion was remembered, kept and celebrated by God's people in our homes with our immediate families. This year, however, God has blessed us not only with another chance to keep and celebrate this time, but we're able to do this together again as a group. All of us together in one room to eat, drink, and be merry, rejoicing before God. Personally, when I look back at last year's remembrance of this time, I wondered if there would be another time that we would be able to get together to celebrate this time and the spring holy days. Maybe you did too. I don't know what another year will bring about and if we'll be able to keep it in peace and safety. All I do know is that we are able to meet again together this year. The title, TNTBMO, the night to be much observed, TNTBMO. The purpose of this message is to be thought-provoking as we dine together this evening, and I will have 2 points that I hope will help us have a more enjoyable night to be much observed. As we already know, there's not a lot of information in the Bible on the night to be much observed, but I promise to do the best I can with what there is. And in order to help aid me, we will be looking at 2 different translations as they bring this passage out differently. But both definitely fit and will work very well to help bring out a deeper and greater appreciation for this occasion. And now, if you join me in Exodus chapter 12 and verse 40. Exodus chapter 12, verse 40. As you're turning, previously in chapter 12, in verse 1, we see the Passover being instituted, the lambs were killed, the Passover meal was ate, and blood from the lamb was spread across the lintel and on the doorposts, thus keeping them protected from the death angel, which was the 10th plague, in which every firstborn would be struck down in their home if their homes were not marked in blood. Then in verse 31, we see the beginning of the Exodus. God has now brought Pharaoh in Egypt to its knees with the 10th plague, and the Israelites are urged to leave in haste. We also know before they left for Ramses, they plundered the Egyptians. And we'll pick it up here in verse 40. And I've chosen to bring out point number 1 using the NIV version. Don't worry, we'll use the King James Version, the New King James Version as well. I'm assuming that's what most of us use in our daily readings. Exodus 12 and verse 40. Now the length of time the Israelite people lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of the 430 years, to the very day, all the Lord's divisions left Egypt, because the Lord kept vigil that night to bring them out of Egypt. On this night, all the Israelites are to keep a vigil to honor the Lord for the generations to come. Point number 1, keep vigil the night. Keep vigil the night. The phrase we use in the Church of God is the night to be much observed. This comes from the King James Version. But now using the NIV, we see the phrasing change and the word vigil being used here. But both observed and vigil have very similar meanings. Observed from the King James is Strong's 8107, Shamor, Shimmur, Shamor. And some of the descriptive words used here are watch, watchfulness, circumspect. Likewise, for the word vigil, according to Merriam-Webster Dictionary, it also means the act of keeping awake. Dictionary.com, a period of watchful attention maintained. Rhetorical question. Have you ever wondered why the word much is used in the night to be much observed? I have, Why not just the night to be observed? Honestly, I hear that version a lot, but that's not the point. Personally, I think it's added to give extra emphasis to the word observed, being much watchful, much awake, much vigilant. It's helping to add to the importance of being vigilant. God wanted the Israelites to know and understand the importance of this night and remember it for generations, as we just read in verse 42 of Exodus 12. But what about now? For us, the spiritual Israelites, is it important to be vigilant? After all, we obviously keep the night to be much observed, and I think we all know and believe it's important to keep this time. First, I'd like to review some scripture we reviewed last night at the Passover and look at a physical act of being vigilant. In the Gospels, Christ taught about the importance of being watchful in many of his teachings. In one particular night, the night of his betrayal, he asked a few of his disciples to watch with him. Let's go to Matthew chapter 26 and verse 36. Again, that was Matthew chapter 26 and verse 36. Then Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane and said to the disciples, "Sit here while I go and pray over there." And he took with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, and he began to be sorrowful, deeply distressed. Then he said to them, "My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch with me." Picture the scene, if you will. We have Jesus, the Christ, the one who all things were created through, becoming sorrowful, deeply distressed in front of these three disciples, seemingly holding no emotion back. I have to imagine this got their attention. I believe it would absolutely get our attention if we were in their shoes. He then voices those very emotions to them, in that his soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. What now are they thinking and feeling? Their rabbi is clearly distraught. Imagine your best friend, your teacher, the one you know as the very Son of God, behaving and expressing these words to you. I believe he had their attention, as he would ours. Remember, he knows he's about to be betrayed, and after grabbing their attention through his physical and verbal actions, putting them on a heightened alert, what does he tell them to do right after that? He says, "Stay here and watch with me." We know how the story goes. Christ would come back 3 times, only to find that they have fallen asleep all 3 times. Unfortunately for those disciples, in the Messiah's most pressing time in need of them to watch, as he asked, they could not stay much awake, very watchful, vigilant. So yes, this was definitely a time in which there was a desperate time to be much observed. How about today? What do we need to be circumspect about? Why would we need to be vigilant? Let's take another look at a teaching on the importance of being vigilant. And let's see if I can really give you something to ponder this evening. 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 8. 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 8. Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. I personally have never been on a safari before. I'm not sure if anyone here has as well, but imagine that we were. We're on one of those award-winning African safaris where they take us out to observe the lions, and at this particular point of the day, it's feeding time. They're hunting their prey. For me, just being out there observing, I would be very vigilant. And if it were feeding time, extremely vigilant. I wouldn't want them to come up empty-handed on not getting a gazelle. And all of a sudden, I become the next best thing for dinner. Kind of a better than going hungry option. And before you know it, they're in the Jeep with you, tearing you to shreds. So yes, it was important to God that the Israelites remember to be vigilant on this night, just as Christ on the night of his betrayal was trying his best to have his disciples watch with him. And even now, for us as well, we need to remember this evening, and not just this evening, but every second of every day, that our adversary is lurking around, just waiting for the slightest of weakness to seize the opportunity to completely shred and destroy the people of God. So unlike the physical watchfulness of the Israelites, standing to eat their meal, dressed in travel clothes to depart from Egypt, our watchfulness is spiritual in nature, ready and alert at all times in every situation, being able to interpret the signs of the time as Christ explained and taught. And just as we looked at the physical act of watching and spiritual act of being vigil, let's keep in mind that we have done the physical act of cleaning on our houses, and also cleaned and examined our spiritual lives as well. We need to be vigilant in keeping our spiritual house clean and replace anything that was removed, sin, and replace it with righteousness. Because if we don't, over time, our house could get filled back up with the very thing we have been told to remove. Once again, sin, which can lead to being ripped to shreds and devoured. And now, let's bring it out in the New King James Version. If you will go back to Exodus 12 and verse 40. Sorry, I should have told you to keep your place there. Exodus 12 and verse 40 from the New King James Version. Now, the sojourn of the children of Israel who lived in Egypt was 430 years. And it came to pass at the end of the 430 years, on that very same day, it came to pass that all the armies of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. It is a night of solemn observance to the Lord for bringing them out of the land of Egypt. This is that night of the Lord, a solemn observance for all the children of Israel throughout their generations. Point number 2, TNTBMO, the night to be much observed, is a solemn observance to the Lord. Okay, I'd like to point out a few things here, as you might already be thinking on that word solemn. That it's a word related to a sad point in time, or a very serious occasion. And according to dictionary.com, it can mean just that, as it uses words like grave, sober, mirthless. I'm sure we'd all agree this kind of attitude is more geared toward how we should approach the Passover, but the night to be much observed as well? Yes and no. Yes, it is a solemn time, but not to be a sad or somber attitude. You see, dictionary.com also states solemn as marked or observed with religious rites, having a religious character, a solemn holy day, which do apply here for the night to be much observed, as it ushers in the beginning of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. As we've seen, the New King James uses the word solemn here in these passages, but that's not in the original text. But the word solemn is definitely used in the Old Testament. It is used some 29 times with 4 different meanings, all sharing, for the most part, the same descriptions. Here are some of the similarities that Strong's uses to describe the word solemn: assembly on a festival, congregation, feast day. Over and over in these 4 descriptions, we see the way God uses the word solemn to refer to his people keeping a feast day in a holy convocation. But there was one that had more definition than the rest. And I would like to highlight that, as I think this will give us the full appreciation of this evening. If you would, come with me to Deuteronomy chapter 16. Deuteronomy chapter 16. Here we'll be reading about the Feast of Tabernacles, and in particular, some of the attitude we're to have at this time. Once again, Deuteronomy chapter 16 and verses 13 through 16. Thou shalt observe the Feast of Tabernacles 7 days. After that, thou hast gathered in thy corn and thy wine, and thou shalt rejoice in thy feast, thou and thy son and thy daughter, and thy manservant and thy maidservant, and the Levite, the stranger, and the fatherless, and the widow that are within thy gates. 7 days shalt thou keep a solemn feast. The New King James uses the word sacred, feast unto the Lord thy God, in the place which the Lord shall choose, because the Lord thy God shall bless thee in all thy increase, and in all the works of thine hands. Therefore thou shalt surely rejoice. How can you go to the Feast of Tabernacles and rejoice, but at the same time have a solemn, sad, somber, mirthless time? You don't. According to Strong's, the original Hebrew here for the word solemn is chagag, C-H-A-G-A-G, and it means, once again, to observe a festival, but also to be giddy, celebrate, dance, and a feast. Brethren, I think we all agree this is the solemn attitude we should have this evening. The night to be much observed is the kickoff, if you will, to the spring holy days. It is a time, just like the Feast of Tabernacles, to eat, drink, and be merry. An evening to be thankful. And because this message is supposed to be thought-provoking, what do we have to be giddy about? What can we celebrate? And what can we be thankful for? I have a couple of bullet points I'd like to present, as they've been on my mind, as I'm sure yours as well. Bullet point 1, how about the mere fact that we're going to be able to celebrate this time together? Unlike last year, when we had no other choice but to keep it at our homes with our immediate families. This time last year, I was wondering if this could be the last night to be much observed in spring holy days, let alone be able to keep the fall holy days. And would there even be a Feast of Tabernacles? But here we are, having celebrated the Feast of Tabernacles last fall, and we're able to keep this night together once again. Bullet point 2, playing off of the first point. Freedom to still assemble and worship right here, right now, in this very room, and this evening meal, and tomorrow, for the first day of unleavened bread. We're not blind to what's happening around us. In fact, because of God's love for us, through his divine word, the Bible, and in particular, Bible prophecy, he has given us an even deeper and greater understanding of these things than the ones who are pushing and driving these movements. With that in mind, we know we need to redeem this time more than ever. Third and final bullet point as I draw to a close. Just as God brought physical Israel out of Egypt, Jesus Christ at his death, which we believe was drawing close at this very time, has freed us, spiritual Israel, at this time. And those whom God will call before the return of Christ and during the 1,000-year millennium and afterward, the second resurrection. In closing, brethren, I hope that this message was thought-provoking to us all and giving us something to ponder and talk about over this wonderful occasion, the night to be much observed, that God has so graciously made possible. Let us pray to always stay spiritually awake, vigil, and let us be as the original Hebrew word for solemn is, to be observed of the festival, and to be giddy, and to celebrate, dance, have a feast before the Lord on this solemn occasion.